Safe, reliable, free, and honest support. Qualities you cannot find online. Until now. Introducing the next generation of online technology support. What technology malfunctions are troubling you? Let us know today on the all-new support forums at www.theapplepost.com.
Welcome to Geek Cross, the podcast where faith and culture intersect. I'm your host, Jeremy Yoder. In each episode, we look at a topic related to pop culture or geekdom and have conversations that use science fiction, fantasy movies, gaming, or comic books as a jumping off point to talk about deeper issues and to wrestle with the big questions of life. My guest this episode is Aleen Sims. Welcome, Aleen. How are you today?
Hello, I'm great. How are you, Jeremy?
I am doing very well, thank you. Aleen, why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Oh my gosh. So I am a writer and podcaster. I live in Phoenix, Arizona. I have a podcast called Less Than or Equal, where I talk to geeky people about the cool things they do. Past guests have included Jeremy Yoder and other cool people. Most of my guests are marginalized in some way. So I've had members of the lesbian, gay, bi, trans, queer community. I've had a lot of women on, and we just talk mostly about the things that they geek out about, whatever the guest of the week is, whatever they're really interested in. But we do kind of delve into issues of diversity and inclusivity in that. And then I also have a fun little podcast I do with my friend Alex Knight and Tempest Bradford about the 1980s cartoon Jem and the Holograms.
So, I gotta ask you this real quick.
Yeah.
What are you thinking about the new Jem and the Holograms movie that's about to come out?
We recorded like a 20-minute rant about it.
So, you're not happy, is what I'm hearing.
Well, I don't see so I don't know if you watched it. I know it was sandwiched between like quote unquote boy shows when it was airing. So I don't know if you ever caught any of the show itself, but there's like this rival band called the Misfits. We didn't see any of that in the preview. The whole thing is predicated upon holograms. We saw no hint of that happening in the preview. So it just seems like this teenage, like pre-coming of age story that is completely bizarre to me. But
It looked very Disney Channel,
yes.
I have to say. So, I wanted to talk a little bit about the episode that I was on when I was on Less Than or Equal.
Oh boy.
It was really early on for me. I think I had done less than 10 podcasts at this point.
I think it was like 4.
Yeah, it was really early on. I was just starting out. I'm now in the 20s. I think I just did 25 or 20. This is like 25 or 26. And you were telling me that you got a little bit of pushback for having me on your podcast.
I did. Just a smidge, not too bad.
And so what kind of stuff was that?
My primary audience, I think, I don't have analytics to back this up, but based on the people who talk to me about the show online, like on Twitter, I think are mostly cisgender white men. And cisgender meaning that they were born, assigned a gender at birth, and that is the gender that they have always identified with. Mm-hmm. But I do have a non-zero number of listeners who are transgender or non-binary, meaning they don't strictly fall into a male or female category or consider themselves either gender. So the pushback mostly came from the transgender and non-binary people who were concerned about me having a pastor on the show. Mm-hmm. And I got some like, I don't know if I can listen to this. And I was like, it's probably not what you're going to expect. You know, give it a shot. You can always stop listening. But it's not, in my opinion, offensive at all. And
Right.
So those people actually did listen and they were like, oh, it was okay. I was all right. So.
Okay, good. I don't want to be out there triggering people.
Yeah, no, and the concern is with there's the stereotypical view of who and what a pastor is, which is, the person you see in the mega churches, Bible thumping, conservative, anti-LGBTQ, And so that's where their concern stemmed from, is kind of that stereotype that people have of pastors.
Well, I mean, it's a stereotype for a reason. There are, a lot of my colleagues who are that way, but I certainly know a lot of colleagues who are not. I remember also, though, that you had a bit, when you had me on, it challenged you a bit well.
Yeah, it did.
I was a little surprised that you kept that in the interview, but why was that challenging to have me on? You know me now a lot better than you did back then.
I do, and I also have that stereotypical view of pastors. Mm-hmm. That is because I grew up, I didn't grow up in a religious household at all, but I grew up around religious people. I went to a Seventh-day Adventist private school for 3 or 4 years. I was really good friends with a Baptist pastor's daughter. My best friends in middle and high schools were very, very religious people. And so I had this view of Christianity that I grew up in, which is not, in a lot of ways, it's at odds with my belief system and what I advocate for, which is inclusivity of all sorts of people, some of which Christianity tends to frown upon from like a literal biblical interpretation standpoint.
Certainly the understanding that same-sex behavior is a sin.
Right.
Yeah. No, I understand that. And I certainly understand, that with the role that I play, that people do view me through that prism. And it's always kind of interesting when I run into that wall. The assumptions that are made about who I am and what I believe. And sometimes that is a negative stereotype, or sometimes it's a positive stereotype. But it's sometimes it's a little bit like dressing up as Santa Claus, because what people see is your role, your character, rather than who you really are. Mm-hmm. Yeah. How many episodes have you done now, Aleen?
I think I just I think I recorded 51 a day or two ago.
Okay.
So
congratulations.
Thank you.
That's quite a bit.
Yeah.
What have you discovered about yourself or about diversity? What has surprised you doing this podcast?
Wow, I don't even know where to start. I have learned a lot about the transgender community. The events in Ferguson, Missouri happened just maybe 6 weeks, 2 months after I started Less Than or Equal. And I've learned a lot about race as a result of both being in like this advocacy space and frankly making more Black friends who are candid and tell me their experiences. I don't even know. Like, it's interesting because a lot of what I've learned, I've kind of internalized, and it's hard to pick those threads out as like, oh, this is something that I've learned, as a direct result of the show. One of my first like big light bulb moments was one of my early episodes with an advocate. She goes into like corporate spaces and helps them diversify or become more friendly to diverse people. And her name is Ash Dryden. And she was talking about how enforcing HTTPS, so secure certified websites, as more important or better than HTTP or unsecured websites is really a classist, elitist thing. And I remember I've listened back on that episode a time or two, and I can hear it in my voice when that light bulb went off. It was like, oh my gosh. And that is when I realized that I have more to learn than I realized.
So what is your basic approach now in dealing with these issues? What has changed for you and how you approach them?
I think the biggest thing, if I were starting the show today with the knowledge that I have, I'm honestly not sure if I would actually start it. One of the biggest things that I have learned is that my job as an advocate for marginalized people is to listen, first and foremost, and secondly, to amplify and not to speak for other people. And so I started the show and I was like, oh, the original concept was it would be a women in tech show. And I thought, okay, well, that's a little narrow. I need to broaden it up to make it like more interesting. And I was like, okay, well, women in STEM fields. And I was like, well, why just limit it to women? Why not just make it to anybody who doesn't really fit into that space that they love and are passionate about? But I'm white and I'm, cisgendered, I am straight. And so I don't know if I would start the show because in some ways I feel like what I'm doing is speaking for other people in these other groups. And there are excellent podcasts by, people of color, by people in the gay community. They're already doing that. So I don't even know if I would have started the show if I had known then what I know now.
I mean, that's really one of the big sort of challenging questions, I think, for those of us who come from positions of privilege is, where is our voice welcome? Even with good intentions, we sometimes mess up. And so how do you speak into a situation that is not necessarily your own? And how do you do it in a way where you honor those other voices and you do not speak over them? Because we see that happen so often. Well-meaning white people who speak and for others and kind of run over them.
Yeah, it's something I struggle with a lot. And Twitter is really other than podcasting, Twitter is where I spend way too much time. But you can see me struggle with this, I think, because I go through these periods where I'm pretty vocal and opinionated about a race issue. And then I kind of drop off and it's just kind of where I am right now, where it's all selfies and pictures of my coffee. And it's something, I am always trying to find the balance in that. I think the beauty of my show is that I have my guests, and the same with Geek Cross. My guest is there to speak on something that I can't speak to.
Right.
And that's good. That's good for me for sure. But yeah, it's a hard question. And the biggest things that I think I have learned is I retweet. I try not to interject myself into things, even though sometimes I really want to. But I do, if I see another white person making a racist remark, I will step in or, whatever. And the other thing that I think you really need to learn if you're kind of in this where you're wanting to help people is to realize, especially, when you want to use your privilege to help people who are less privileged, you're going to get things wrong. And the biggest thing I've learned how to do is, as an adult, just kind of in general, but more specifically, in the last year or so, is how to apologize and really step away from myself and my pride and my ego and learn how to say, well, I totally screwed that up. I'm so sorry. I will not do that again. And that's a hard thing to do because I'm a pretty arrogant person sometimes.
Yeah. I mean, one of the topics that I would love to do sometime is about the Charleston shooting and, the history of violence in churches and black churches. That hit me emotionally pretty deeply when that happened. But, I don't feel qualified to do that on my own. And I haven't been able to find the guest yet that can speak into that, to have some sort of conversation with. I think for those of us who are in privilege, we need to be careful to spend most of our time listening.
Yep.
And affirming what people are saying and how they're feeling and where they're at, without sort of dictating or trying to control the conversation. And I think that's not an easy thing to do, especially since as a white male, I am told by culture and by society that I am normal.
Right.
This is what normal looks like. And that is affirmed. And anything outside of my experience is sort of abnormal and strange. And so at some point you kind of have to learn to be quiet.
Mm-hmm. And that's hard. And I think especially coming from a position of privilege, with race relations being what they are in the United States right now, I think it's hard as a white person to take yourself out of it. The whole, on Twitter about a year ago, there was the not all men, not quite a year ago, I guess, but it was, there was women saying men do XYZ, men catcall and grope me on the subway and, inappropriate things. And the response from a lot of people was like, I've never done that. And so there's this hashtag, not all men, that came up. And I kind of feel like that sometimes when I'm reading through my timeline and people of color are talking about their experiences, and it's like, white people are awful and white people do all this stuff. And I'm like, I've never done that thing. And I have to step back and like, it's not about me. It's about these people and their experience. And I've got to take myself out of that and listen to what this group of people has experienced.
I think that's one thing that's really hard is to accept that it's not about you.
Right.
We are a very narcissistic culture, and we're told it is about you.
Right.
and just, to come to that point and say it's not about me. That somebody who's expressing some pain and anger, it may not be about me, but I still need to listen to that.
Right. And I benefit, like it's not about me, but I benefit from the way other people are treated poorly. Like it's a thing. It happens. That's privilege.
So, I've been thinking a lot about diversity because, right now we're in the middle of this major culture shift where Anglo-Protestant culture that has dominated in the United States is dying. And, a lot of the people that I deal with and have relationships with are out of that Anglo-Protestant culture. And so many of them are feeling marginalized. The recent Supreme Court decision legalizing same-sex marriage, that was a move that they felt marginalized by. And so I have to ask myself, what really is diversity? If diversity is simply replacing one political paradigm and cultural paradigm with another, is that really diversity? Who speaks in our culture, who has voice in our culture? I'm struggling with some of those questions right now.
6 months ago, I would have had a hard time seeing your perspective on this. I don't know. I am from a very, very conservative area and a very conservative family. And I don't know how I ended up so liberal. I have no clue how this happened, but I'm kind of like, well, just get over it. Which is like super callous. I know. But you have helped me kind of understand and think about it more than I would have otherwise. And I don't have an answer. It's hard for me because the things that are happening are the things that I'm working to make happen, And I have a lot of sympathy for people who feel threatened and who are scared. And I don't really know what to tell them.
I mean, I think if I was in a progressive community and in a progressive church, it'd be a very different experience for me.
Yeah, I agree.
But because I'm in a conservative town, in a congregation that leans conservative, is a divided congregation. There are some liberals there. It's something that I've been wrestling with because these are people who I'm trying to pastor and trying to serve and trying to sort of guide through some very difficult things, and they are experiencing, I think, very profound grief. I have a really hard time with people like Franklin Graham, who sort of shoots off his mouth and says horrible things. And I remember one time I was complaining about what I see as the politics of grievance. And one of my colleagues said to me, that's grief. People are experiencing grief because they're in the midst of change that they never wanted to happen. And so that really made me think. And, I care for people who politically I don't have much in common with.
Right.
And so that puts me sometimes in a pretty tricky position in those relationships.
Yeah, I think it's so hard for me because I'm not surrounded by people with vastly different viewpoints. I've intentionally made that happen. And it's so hard for me. I feel compassion, but I feel like so much of what is currently happening, like the same-gender marriage being constitutional, I feel like it's a step in the right direction. I think it's a step in the direction toward acceptance and inclusivity of people. And what I struggle so much with, and I think part of the reason I got the feedback I did, before people listened to your show of Less Than or Equal, is this judgment, I think, that is being imparted upon the LGBTQ community. And I keep coming back to, like, biblically, the Bible says, you know, you're not supposed to judge people. Like, that's not for you to do. That's for God to do. And I keep coming back to that. Like, it's not for you to judge. And I know that you've been in this position of privilege for a very long time, your entire life, and for your parents' entire lives. And, you know, back and back and back, but this isn't for you to judge. And why, like, I get accusatory in my head. Like, why are you so judgmental? Why does this matter to you? This does not impact you at all. You know, you and I have talked about some nuance to that kind of helped me understand a little bit more how people feel impacted. But at the end of the day, marriage specifically is not just a religious institution. Like, you and I have discussed, like, I got married, but, you know, my husband and I are not at all religious. We aren't planning on having children. Like, so why did we get married? Well, there are legal protections. You know, if one of us gets hurt, we can see each other in the hospital. There's no, like, if heaven forbid he dies, the house clearly belongs to me, even though my name's not on it, you know, whereas before it was like, well, you know, even though I live with you, the house would go to your mom, you know. And so that's what marriage is in our culture right now. I understand that there are many people believe that it's a covenant between a couple and God, but our society has kind of mixed all of that up into one thing.
Well, we've entangled these things.
Yeah.
You know, in Western Europe, in a lot of Europe, you know, pastors who are not part of state churches, and in the case of Germany, Lutheran or Catholic, are not actually allowed to perform legal marriages. That is done by, you know, civil marriage, by the courts, and then couples that are religious go on to have a religious ceremony. So these two things are kept separate. The way I've understood it is, you know, the Supreme Court changed the legal definitions of marriage, the contractual aspects of it, but the religious aspect of it, that court has no jurisdiction over that.
Right. No one can take that away.
No one can take that away, but I think what makes it difficult is this idea that you kind of have to share marriage with people you think shouldn't get married. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where a lot of people are struggling with, that what they believe that somebody else can enter into the same institution but have a completely different set of beliefs about what that means. And so you can kind of ignore it with heterosexual marriage. You can kind of impose your own meaning upon that. It makes it really difficult, though, when you're dealing with same-sex couples, if that's what you believe.
Right.
Yeah. So anyway, I'm just asking some questions right now and wrestling with some things. I mean, we're in the middle of a denominational split.
I know. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's pretty painful, and even that doesn't fit cleanly across lines. You know, some of the most outspoken critics of same-sex marriage are the Hispanic Mennonite churches and what we call immigrant churches, non-white Caucasian churches. And so there's been this dynamic of kind of pitting, you know, the gays versus the people of color, and that's a really unfortunate dynamic, but it's something that we have been wrestling with.
Yeah, it's so hard. Like, I have a lot of sympathy for you and kind of watching this, you know, kind of a little bit through your lens, because, you know, I'm reading articles that you send me and talking to you, you know, briefly about things that are happening, and it's a cultural upheaval, and that's kind of, you know, that's where we are in the United States right now. I feel like everything is coming to a head at once. You know, we've got a lot of tension in the United States right now about, like, race relations and LGBTQ rights and women's reproductive rights, and, like, all of this is happening at the same time. So I've got a lot of sympathy.
I mean, I've been pretty upset about, you know, Donald Trump doing so well as he is in the Republican primaries. And I have family members who, you know, completely support what he has to say, and he is tapping into something so deeply ugly. And I grieve that, you know.
To me, he's almost farcical.
Well, he is a joke. I mean,
yeah.
But people take it seriously. People are not. You know, people are taking this as something legitimate. It's not just a joke.
he takes it seriously too. I mean, it's frightening. I mean, all politicians are privileged. All of them have I think that there's a certain type of person who gets into politics, a certain personality type. But in order to do this at like the national, like presidential level, you have to have money. You have to be connected. Like, when was the last time Donald Trump worried about the cost of groceries? When was the last time he wondered if he'd be able to buy shoes for his children? When was the last time he missed a subway and didn't get to work on time? He is so privileged and so unaware of how out of the ordinary his life is that it's just like a black comedy just watching. It's awful.
Yeah, well, I mean, you live also in a place that has some of these dynamics to it. Arizona is an interesting state to be watching. And some of your political things. I mean, I recall, recently there was that huge protest at the mosque in Phoenix, and yeah, it's just this weird kind of thing, and they're your neighbors.
Yeah.
They're my neighbors too. My next door neighbor flies a Confederate flag, and I have no idea how to talk to him about it.
Yep. I understand. It's interesting because there are so many liberal people here that, and again, I have chosen to surround myself by pretty liberal people, that sometimes there's this dissonance that happens. Like when I heard about the protest at the mosque, I was just like, that's not happening where I live. Like it's not happening where I live, but it definitely was happening where I live. And I remember checking Twitter that night over and over and over again because I just knew, because Arizona is an open carry state. It's you don't have to have a permit to to have a concealed gun or own a gun, and I just knew that someone was going to die that night. I'm glad I was wrong, but it's interesting, there have been a lot of things about like women's reproductive rights, about like the state determining when a pregnancy, like when conception happens, so that they can dictate like abortion stuff. There's been legislation about not allowing transgender people to use the restroom for their identified gender, identified in quotes, for their gender. So it's kind of hostile here if you pay attention.
I mean, and I think that's one of the things sometimes that we sort of forget. We try to find communities that look like us and sound like us, or believe the same things, and that's sort of a normal human nature. But it's hard being a liberal in a conservative area, just as it's hard to be a conservative in a liberal area. And the sense of not fitting in and not having your perspective validated by the culture around you. That's always a difficult place to be in, regardless of your political views.
Yeah, it's like being on an alien planet, like you've been transplanted and nobody, like, you speak a different language. It's interesting to me how different people are. I think that it's probably not until we reach our late 20s or early 30s that we're really able to understand that other people have like different perspectives, because we're so wrapped up in ourselves figuring out who we are. But, sometimes even now I'm like, why can't everybody think like me? Clearly I'm correct in all of this. And I don't understand why you have to have a different point of view that I totally don't understand. But yeah, a lot of the time I feel like I'm in Bizarro world, and I look around and I'm like, why do you care what bathroom that person is using? And what does it matter to you when a woman's pregnancy starts? Like, these are things that are between like a woman and her doctor. And it's really interesting to kind of live here and like scratch my head a lot of the time.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, it's the experience, out of my own background of sort of being part of a religiously distinctive group, where you don't ever fit in. I mean, the Amish or the conservative Mennonites have very distinctive dress, and even those of us who are more liberal, we carry certain distinctives with us, even though we can disappear and pass as normal. You know, for me, I think one of the hardest times of my life was right after 9/11, where as part of my religious belief, I disagreed with the decision to go to war. And yet I turned on the television and horrible things were said about people who are pacifists or questioned any of this, you know, being quote unquote objectively pro-terrorist. And so it's hard. It's hard when the culture tells you you're weird and you're wrong and you don't fit in.
Yeah, definitely. I'm trying to think about like 9/11, and there was just so much happening. We as a nation were really on edge. I remember the mall in the small town where I was going to college shutting down, and I was like, there's no way anybody is going to make this, you know, teeny tiny mall a target. But I think it was definitely a major landmark in our history, and I think that we're still kind of feeling the consequences of that.
I think it upset the order that we had sort of gotten used to.
Yeah.
We assumed that America now was in charge and democracy was on the rise and the communists had lost, and the world was being remade in our image.
And we were safe.
And that ended up being an illusion.
Yeah, it was shocking, for sure.
So on this theme of sort of distinctiveness, what kind of, in your podcast, what kind of themes have you heard from the kinds of people that you've interviewed about their experiences?
What
are some of the commonalities?
I think the biggest commonality I hear is people just want to live their lives and be left alone. We talk about fear and persecution and being treated poorly. And I think what it all boils down to is everybody wants to be treated well, not fabulously, but, you know, people don't want to be harassed or catcalled or, you know, fear for their lives.
They want to be respected.
Yeah.
Want to be respected.
Yeah, that's a better word for it. Yeah. I mean, really, if you were to sum up Less Than or Equal, I think that would be the thing. Like, it's a podcast about respecting people.
We make it sound like your show is super serious, but it is also, I think, a show. What I like about it is that it's about people's passions as well.
Right.
And so what kind of passions have you had conversations about or have you heard about?
Oh, gosh. Well, so one of the goals of the show is it's really easy to get steeped down into like, oh, everything is awful, you know, everything is horrible, there is no hope, like just abandon it and be sad. And what I really wanted the show to be was like, I wanted to have role models and people who, you know, like maybe a kid could listen to the show and be like, oh my gosh, that sounds like me, I can be a game developer. Or, you know, whatever. That was part of what I wanted to do. And I've had all sorts of people on. I've had a male cheerleader who totally came on and geeked out about like what he's good at in cheerleading and what he's not. You know, I've had game developers, I've had other podcasters, I've had authors, diversity experts, WordPress programmers or WordPress developers. Oh gosh, I have had like a huge cross section of people, and I haven't even like hit the tip of the iceberg yet. I've had so many people sharing what they're passionate about. It's a lot of fun. A lot of the time, we laugh a lot. There are some episodes that are more serious, but I think there's a lot of laughter in it, and I think it's perfect.
What are the things that you feel passionate about as you're doing this?
What am I passionate about? Lego. I've been known to rant about Lego. One thing that I've discovered about myself, you asked me earlier, and I don't think I provided a very good answer, but I think one of the things that I've learned about myself is that I am a mega introvert, but I am very passionate about people. And one thing I love about the show is that it gives me the opportunity to get to know people on some level. And some guests have become friends like you, and some I've only talked to on the podcast, and that's been it. But I get to know like a greater cross section of humanity, and I think that's really cool. So I'm passionate about talking to people. I'm passionate about amplifying voices. I'm passionate about, you know, all the wrongs that Lego has done. Oh, they're so bad, Jeremy. They're so bad.
Oh, no, I know. I've got two girls who are really into Lego, and, very mixed feelings about Lego Friends.
Yeah, me too.
Fortunately, the new elves, have kind of pushed the Lego Friends aside, and we're kind of directing them towards the elves right now.
I kind of like the elves. They're kind of cute.
They are cute. It's still got pink and stuff, but it's not, I don't think, quite as gendered as as the Friends were.
Yeah, my objection to the Friends was never like the stereotypical pink and purple, although I do wish that they just integrated like those pretty colors, because they are pretty colors, says she with pink and purple hair. I wish that they had integrated those colors into the main sets instead of making girl sets and boy sets. But my main issue is that, they're fewer pieces for the same amount of money, and they're extremely, there have been a couple of sets that are like, oh, here's the inventor, but there are also like, here's the baker, and here's like the flower shop, and here's the, like, I don't know, hairdresser, and a lot of like stereotypical female things are just available in the girl set. So it leaves out all the boys who might be like, I want to be a hairdresser someday, I want to play with flowers. And it also, like, it's just feeding into this girls and boys have different roles and different jobs that they can do. And also, like, there's this really cool plane that they've come out with, and the pilot is a dude. And I'm like, pilot could have long blonde hair and be totally cute and pilot that plane. So yeah, that's my Lego rant.
Well, I mean, Lego didn't invent the problem. I think back in the 50s or 60s, Lionel, the model train company, tried to sell trains to girls by coming out with a pink set that, of course, did not sell well. And that was it for Lionel's experimentation with models for girls. But Lego seems to certainly be continuing some of those problems. Well,
and society's changed a lot in the last 50 years, 60 years, I think that gender roles were much more defined then than they are now. And we're still dealing with the aftershocks of living in a very gender established society, by which I mean men do one thing, women do the other. And I think that this is just kind of a holding on to that a little bit.
Well, I mean, for me, as a parent of two little girls, the trouble is that my girls also love some of this stuff. Right. And my youngest loves Disney princesses and plays with little Disney princess figures. Now, they play with them in ways that are not necessarily, stereotypical girl play, but they love them. And so it's kind of hard to simply, deny my daughters access to things that they love, even though they make me uneasy.
I reject the notion that girls can't love princesses, and I know this is not what you're saying, but I hear it a lot. But I reject the notion that girls can't love princesses and also be geeks, loving Star Wars and computers and, those stereotypical geeky things. When I was at WWDC last month, and I got a little tote bag that had the word princess on it, and it was crossed out, and below it said inventor. And I was like, well, why can't I be both? I'm a liberated woman. I can have it all. I understand, as a girl who grew up with Disney, I totally and completely understand, those stereotypes and those myths that the princesses feed into. But, I think if a girl wants to be a princess and have a lightsaber, she can be a princess and have a lightsaber. I'm not one of the people who's like, oh, all princesses must die. Like, I do think that there are definitely, as a non-parent, I'll tell you, I think there are definitely conversations to be had with them as they grow. Like, oh, gee, wasn't it weird that, I don't know, Sleeping Beauty had to be kissed by that prince? Like, what was up with that? There are definitely conversations to be had.
We've had some of those conversations.
I bet you have.
I mean, my oldest daughter has picked up things out there in the ether and said things that we kind of shocked us, we had to kind of a conversation about. She's been playing one of the Mario World games. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden started talking about, because of Princess Peach always having to be rescued, and princesses always need to be rescued. And it broke my wife's heart, because we have been pushing books on her about there's a book series for young kids called Rescue Princesses, about these princesses that go out and rescue people and animals and things like that. And yet still, thanks a lot, Nintendo.
Right.
Still,
And they're still doing it.
They're still doing it. But, there's also encouragement. We were out east a few weeks ago for a funeral, and we were driving with my cousin and his daughter, and they were talking in the back seat. His daughter was talking about that she's a tomboy and that she likes boy toys. And all of a sudden, my daughter just pops out with, there's no such thing as girl toys and boy toys.
Nice.
So she's listening, she's absorbing it. And, she likes the princesses. She likes things that are pink. But, the other day, our Blu-ray player died, and we ripped it apart so that she could look at all the parts. And we put together a model of a Trebuchet the other day. And today, we've been playing the Lord of the Rings card game, which is much more advanced than her.
I was going to say, that sounds pretty...
It's pretty intense. It took us a couple of weeks to figure out the rules and the mechanics, and I'm still figuring it out because these things are so convoluted. But she understands, the basic concept of this game, and with some help is able to make decisions about which cards to play. This is a game where each round has 7 phases to it, and she understands it and talks about wanting to be an inventor, and now is asking for her own tool set. So I think sometimes kids are able to hold things together in ways that we're not able to, and they don't make those distinctions.
Yeah, I think that I don't know if it's societal or if it's brain development or a combination of the two. But I worked with kids for a long time, and sometimes things are very black and white with kids. But sometimes you can have like these posing ideas and it's fine. Like it makes sense to them or it doesn't bother them. And it's just interesting to watch and see where what falls in that, like food, food must always be, covered in ketchup, but it's okay that, there are no girl toys or boy toys, but Princess Peach always has to be rescued.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting. So we've been at this for about 50 minutes or so. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about?
So you've been doing this for almost 6 months now, very, if not exactly, pretty close to it. How's podcasting going and what have you learned?
I've learned the importance of putting something out there, even if it's not as good as I would like it to be. One of my biggest issues is that I have a tendency to be a perfectionist. I want things to be perfect. I have definitely put out podcasts that are less than perfect. I would say the majority of what I've put out has been less than perfect.
It's
or less
hard.
to my ideal. It's hard. And sometimes you put out an episode and it's just like, this isn't good. Who's going to listen to this? I can't believe I put this out. And then you get good feedback. So, I think I've learned to be not quite so hard on myself. What's important is the work. What's important is putting something out, regardless of whether or not anybody's listening. I mean, it's nice if people are listening, but it's not, I think, the most important thing. That's not why I'm doing this. And I think that has been a good realization for me. One of the things I liked, and I can't remember what the term was that you used, but you have a friend that talks about practicing in public, iterating in public.
Iterating in public, yeah.
And I think the podcast for me, in the same way that preaching was or is iterating in public and learning how to have conversations and learning how to handle the technology and the audio aspects of it and making mistakes and moving on, I think has been a really good thing for me. Another thing I think I've learned is, for me, what's important is that there is some sort of religious voice out there, but that's not necessarily the same kind of voice that there's been in the past. Maybe a voice that's a little more humble, a little more listening, a little more willing to share at the table, but still be at the table.
I think that one thing that I have learned from you is his grace for the people I don't agree with. Mm-hmm. So thank you because it was through the podcast I started listening, and just in those first 4 episodes, I had a lot of moments where I was like, oh, okay. I understand, part of what's happening now. I can have more compassion for these people whose viewpoints are so different from mine, and in conversations that we've had since then. So I greatly appreciate that you're doing this and that you're teaching people like me to, I don't know, inadvertently, I don't think you're like trying to beat anyone over the head, but you're very good at, I think, articulating what's happening. Mm-hmm. And that's been very helpful to me.
Well, thank you. I think actually that my largest, again, I have no analytics. I don't know this for sure, but I suspect based on the conversations that I've had, the largest group that listens to this podcast is not religious. And I think that's a good thing.
I do too. I think, Justin and I, my husband and I talked about it. And I was like, I'm not inclined to go back to Christianity, but if I were, I think that, that there is a brand of Christianity that could work for me as liberal as I am. And that's not something that I was aware of because, as I said earlier, I grew up with very, very conservative Christians. And in my mind, up until, 6 months ago, that was the only kind of Christian there was. Mm-hmm. So I think it's extremely beneficial to have a more moderate voice who's out there and talking about stuff. And I like hearing the intersections of geekery and Christianity, and you weave threads together really well, and I appreciate it. It's good.
Well, thank you. There are a lot of people out there who are very theologically minded who are also incredible geeks, and my hope is, right now I've kind of sort of played on the edges of some of that. I've not had any other pastors on this podcast. I've had 3 lawyers, but I haven't had any pastors. And I think I need to start. One of the places I want to take this show is bring in some of those voices like mine, who are very geeky, very culturally aware, but also theologically minded.
I think it makes sense that people who are theologically minded would be attracted to geekery, because I'm going to use the word mythology to refer to the Bible here, and I hope that's.
I'm not offended. No.
Okay, it's like mythology in the sense of it's anyway.
Well, I'm doing a preaching series right now on the book of Genesis. I'm going through the book of Genesis. And that book certainly has a sense in the way that it is written of mythology and of story. That these are stories that are intended to be told.
Well, the events of Genesis are big. Everything in Genesis is big. There's the creation of the world, and there's the flood of the world, and there's isn't Sodom and Gomorrah, that's in Genesis, right?
That's in Genesis, right? Yes.
Yeah, the destruction of cities. Genesis is huge. It's all these big events. So yeah, yeah. But there is so much to the Bible, I think is what I'm trying to say. But there's so much, if you think about Star Wars and Star Trek and Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and how intricate all of this is, I can see how that would appeal to people who are theologically minded, just because it's all similar in a way.
There are some similarities. I think sometimes, people who are, like Joseph Campbell, who kind of make these arguments about the universality of things, probably take it a little too far. But they also have a point. There are some themes that cross over that are central to human experience. And I think in a lot of ways, geek stuff like Star Wars or Star Trek or whatever is our latest version of these kinds of stories. Yeah.
They share a lot. There are a lot of themes,
But I think you asked me what I've learned. I think, being kinder to myself, being more comfortable with my voice, being able to talk of things about that I feel passionate about without having to worry that I'm speaking for God, which is what happens when I preach, has been incredibly freeing for me and certainly fulfilled a need that I've had.
Good. That is good.
And certainly the community that I have gotten to know in podcasting.
There's some good folks.
There are. So, Aleen, where can we find you out there on the internet?
I am on Twitter. It's at Aleen, Aleen. And you can find most of my stuff through that. Less than or equals at lessthanorEqual.com. I have a blog at aleenmean.com. And yeah, just Twitter's kind of the hub where you can go and find me.
All right. Well, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.
If you like Geek Cross, you can help us out and leave us a review at iTunes. We are on Twitter. Our handle is at Geek Cross Show. You can also email us at geekcrossshow@gmail.com. This is a McLaren production. My name is Jeremy Yoder. Thank you for listening.